I speak to you for the first time as Prime Minister.
We're facing certain defeat on land, the annihilation of our army, and imminent invasion.
We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall never surrender.
You know the image. The Bulldog scowl, a cigar clamped between his teeth, 2 fingers raised in the V for victory sign. It's the portrait of defiance the world remembers, but it's only half the story. Behind that iron mask was a man of staggering contradictions, a leader who inspired millions, yet made decisions that sparked outrage, a man who could move a nation with a single speech, yet alienate his closest allies with a single sentence. He was a brilliant writer, painter, soldier, and statesman, who also gambled fortunes, endorsed shocking policies, and once vanished from the battlefield in a story so wild it sounds like a movie script. Some remember him as Britain's greatest hero. Others still debate the darker choices he made, choices that could have destroyed his legacy entirely. This isn't just another retelling of Winston Churchill's life. This is the untold side, the hidden battles, the bizarre habits, the bold gambles, and the moments history politely leaves out. Because if you think you already know Churchill, you might only know the myth. He was born into privilege on November 30th, 1874, not in a modest home but in Blenheim Palace, an estate so vast it could swallow small towns whole. His father, Lord Randolph Churchill, was a rising star in politics. His mother, Jenny Jerome, was a glamorous American socialite. It should have been the perfect upbringing. But in truth, young Winston was practically a stranger to his parents. They were often away, absorbed in their own social and political worlds. The person who raised him, the one he loved most, was his nanny, Mrs. Elizabeth Everest. He called her Womany, and later admitted she was my dearest and most intimate friend during the whole 20 years I had lived. School was no kinder to him. He struggled with academics, especially foreign languages, and failed his entrance exams for the Royal Military College at Sandhurst, not once, but twice. On his 3rd try, he barely scraped in, and only for the cavalry division, which had lower academic requirements than the infantry. He called those school years the least agreeable, and only barren and unhappy period of his life. But something unexpected happened. Once at Sandhurst, he suddenly excelled, finishing 20th out of 130 cadets. The difference? He finally had subjects that sparked his interest: strategy, history, leadership. The boy who'd been labeled a failure was now armed with fierce ambition and a hunger for adventure that would send him straight into the world's most dangerous conflicts. Most young men fresh out of military school were content with safe postings. Churchill wasn't. He didn't just want to serve. He wanted to be seen. And he knew there was no faster path to fame than a war zone. In 1895, at just 21, he talked his way onto a semi-official mission to Cuba during its war for independence. He saw combat for the first time and picked up a lifelong love for Cuban cigars. From there, he moved like a man chasing danger. India's northwest frontier, trading fire with tribal fighters. Sudan's Battle of Omdurman, one of the last great cavalry charges in history. His letters home hinted at something most officers wouldn't admit: disillusionment. "You cannot gild it," he wrote about war. "The raw comes through." But it was in South Africa that his legend truly began. In 1899, covering the Boer War as a reporter, his armored train was ambushed. Churchill was captured and sent to a POW camp. The world assumed that was the end of the story. It wasn't. One night, he scaled the prison wall, vanished into the dark, and, with no map, no compass, and no real plan, trekked through enemy territory. By sheer luck, he stumbled upon a British coal mine manager who hid him in a mine shaft for 3 days, then smuggled him out in a wool-filled rail car to Mozambique. News of the escape made him a household name in Britain. He'd turned a war assignment into a headline-grabbing adventure, and a launchpad into politics. But if he thought political life would be safer than the battlefield, he was wrong. Churchill entered Parliament in 1900 as a 25-year-old conservative. but it didn't take long for him to prove he wasn't built for party loyalty. Just 4 years later, in a move that shocked his colleagues, he crossed the floor to join the Liberal Party. It wasn't just a political gamble. It was a declaration that he'd follow his own path, even if it made enemies. As president of the Board of Trade and later Home Secretary, he pushed through bold social reforms, a minimum wage, labor exchanges to help the unemployed, and the first health and unemployment insurance in Britain's history. For some, he was a visionary. For others, a dangerous radical. But controversy seemed to follow him. In 1911, during the siege of Sydney Street, 2 armed burglars were trapped in a burning building. Churchill reportedly blocked firefighters from putting out the blaze, insisting it was better to let the building burn than risk more lives. The suspects died inside. Even more jarring was his open support for eugenics, writing that the unnatural and increasingly rapid growth of the feeble-minded should be cut off and sealed up. He was fearless in reform and ruthless in decision-making, but in just a few years, his boldness would lead him into one of the greatest disasters in British military history and nearly end his career for good. The disaster came in 1915. As First Lord of the Admiralty, Churchill championed the Gallipoli campaign, a bold naval assault meant to knock the Ottoman Empire out of the war. Instead, it became a catastrophe. Poor planning, fierce resistance, and heavy losses turned it into one of Britain's worst military failures. A commission later cleared him of most of the blame, but the damage was done. He resigned from the Admiralty, his political career in ruins. For the next decade, he was in and out of government, and by 1929, he was completely out. These were his wilderness years, a political exile when most saw him as a relic of the past. But Churchill never stopped working. He wrote books and articles, earning a fortune with his pen. He painted hundreds of canvases, retreating into landscapes and still lifes. Yet even as he pursued art, his mind was on a growing threat overseas. Throughout the 1930s, he warned anyone who would listen about Adolf Hitler and Nazi Germany. He called for rearmament, dismissed the policy of appeasement, and predicted that ignoring the danger would be catastrophic. Almost no one listened. He was mocked in Parliament, sidelined by his own party, and labeled a warmonger. But in 1938, when Czechoslovakia was dismantled under Hitler's pressure, his warnings no longer sounded paranoid. They sounded prophetic. And within a year, war would bring him back from exile to the highest office in the land. May 10, 1940, the very day Germany launched its invasion of France and the Low Countries, Winston Churchill became Prime Minister of Britain. The nation stood alone, staring down the Nazi war machine, and Churchill felt an almost eerie sense of readiness. "All my life," he wrote, "had been but a preparation for this hour and for this trial." He turned words into weapons, his speeches, blood, toil, tears, and sweat. "We shall fight on the beaches," this was their finest hour, were more than rhetoric. They were fuel for a battered nation, lighting fires of defiance when surrender seemed logical. He wrote them himself, often in what he called psalm form, using rhythm and imagery to keep listeners hanging on every syllable. Few knew he carried a speech impediment, a slight lisp that made his S sound distinct. His dentures were specially designed to preserve it, believing that changing his voice could weaken his authority over the airwaves. One set of those dentures, nicknamed the teeth that saved the world, later sold for more than £15,000. But leadership in war meant making decisions that would haunt him. In July 1940, fearing the French fleet might fall into Nazi hands, he ordered the attack on the French naval base at Mers-el-Kébir. Over 1,000 French sailors died. "It was heartbreaking," he said, "but necessary." Even at home, the strain was visible. His wife Clementine wrote warning him about his rough, sarcastic, and overbearing manner. Yet in public, he remained the unshakable face of resistance, a bulldog in human form. And while his speeches echoed across the world, another war was being fought in silence, one of secrets, spies, and machines that could turn the tide. While armies clashed on the front lines, Churchill was building a different kind of weapon: alliances. It was an unlikely trio: Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin. He'd spent much of his career attacking communism, yet he now called for cooperation with the Soviet leader, famously quipping, "If Hitler invaded hell, I would make at least a favorable reference to the devil." It wasn't friendship, it was survival. With Roosevelt, the relationship ran deeper. They exchanged over 1,700 letters and telegrams, met in person 11 times, and strategized the future of the war and the post-war world. Churchill also backed a top-secret operation that would become one of the war's greatest advantages, the code breakers at Bletchley Park. Cracking the German Enigma codes allowed Britain to anticipate enemy moves. Churchill called the cryptanalysts "my geese who laid the golden eggs and never cackled." He used their intelligence sparingly, careful never to tip off the enemy that their codes were broken. But there are darker claims too. Reports suggest that in the late 1940s, Churchill privately urged the US to consider a preemptive nuclear strike against the Soviet Union, while America still had the monopoly on atomic weapons. These accounts remain unverified, but they reveal the depth of his post-war anxiety and his willingness to think in extreme terms to prevent another global conflict. His influence was so great that he even secured France a permanent seat on the UN Security Council, partly to counterbalance Soviet power. By 1945, he had helped lead Britain to victory, but the next chapter would deliver an irony so sharp it stunned the world. The people he had saved were about to vote him out. In July 1945, just weeks after the war in Europe ended, Winston Churchill faced an election and lost. The Labour Party swept to power in a landslide. It was a stunning reversal. Britain's wartime hero was now out of office. Churchill didn't sulk. "That is democracy," he said, "what we have been fighting for." But his voice was far from gone. Less than a year later, in Fulton, Missouri, he delivered the famous Iron Curtain speech, warning that Soviet expansion threatened a new era of division. Many historians see that moment as the unofficial start of the Cold War. In 1951, he returned as Prime Minister, older but still formidable. Yet declining health forced him to resign in 1955. He never again held high office, but his influence on world affairs remained. Recognition came in unexpected forms. In 1953, he won the Nobel Prize in Literature for his sweeping histories and wartime memoirs. Outside politics, he painted over 600 canvases, finding peace in landscapes and still lifes. And then, there were the eccentricities. The custom jumpsuits he wore during late-night work sessions, the time White House staff walked in to find him naked while dictating notes, and a slight gambling problem that cost him dearly in the 1929 stock market crash. He died in 1965 at age 90, on the very same date his father had died 70 years earlier. Britain mourned not just a leader, but a complex figure whose shadow still stretches across history. From a lonely boy who struggled in school to a statesman whose words steeled a nation's will to fight, Winston Churchill's life defies simple labels. He was a soldier, a journalist, a politician, an artist, a man of dazzling talents and deep flaws. His leadership during Britain's darkest hours secured his place in history, yet his career was marked by controversies. The siege of Sydney Street, his support for eugenics, and ruthless wartime decisions that still spark debate. He could charm with a speech, gamble away a fortune, inspire with a vision, or alienate with a single cutting remark. His story is a reminder that greatness is rarely pure and never perfect. Churchill once said, "History will be kind to me, for I intend to write it." He did, but the fuller truth lies between the lines, in the contradictions that made him human. And perhaps that's why his legacy endures. Not as a flawless icon, but as a man who, for all his imperfections, bent the arc of history when it mattered most. And that is why Winston Churchill is larger than life. History.